This is a live look at downtown Cedar Rapids at 9:34 on this Friday morning, Friday the 13th, a Friday we won't soon forget in Cedar Rapids, that's for sure, as the Cedar River has taken over downtown Cedar Rapids.
Everything's gone. It's really hard to deal with. I'm thinking about just moving back to California because I can't live like this.
There is now a mandatory evacuation in effect. No matter where you live, if you can see the river within a block of your house, you must evacuate.
Yeah.
The railroad bridge has collapsed. It is now floating downstream in the Cedar River.
Damn it, I really like that stuff. That nice blue roof.
We worked our entire life for what we had, but it's gone.
I'm not asking for handouts. It kills me to have to fill out these papers and stand in line for handouts. But I don't have any choice at this point. My life is in the hands of somebody else.
5 years ago, I could not have been standing at this place, at this time, on the banks of the Cedar River. That's because the water would have been 19 feet above my head. Good evening, I'm Tiffany O'Donnell.
And I'm Scott Sanborn. In the spring of 2008, the people of the corridor and beyond, from Cedar Falls to Iowa City, faced the unthinkable, faced a nightmare, faced the biggest challenge of recent memory. 5 years ago, the waters of the Cedar River roared out of their banks. Over just a few days, 18,000 people forced from their homes, nearly 8,000 homes damaged by floodwaters.
And 1,300 homes destroyed, 7,000 jobs lost in Cedar Rapids alone. And as we've seen, everything is gauged in terms of the 2008 floods, before the floods, after the floods. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at some of the worst, most challenging moments faced by our communities and what we've done in the 5 years since.
Join us as we spend the next hour rising above the waters. The corridor 5 years later.
Mays Island, no longer an island, it is underwater at this point.
It's hard to see everything go. I mean, like, memories of my kids' pictures gone, probably.
Everything's been so chaotic all along that just wait.
Just a bureaucratic blunder again by the city, I think.
To work over 30 years and to lose what you worked a lifetime for, it was devastating. I don't know how much stress they expect us to handle before they actually start helping us.
It's not like we didn't know this was coming. In the spring of 2008, all across the Midwest, flood watches and warnings were being issued by the National Weather Service. Welcome back to Rising Above the Waters, the corridor 5 years later. I'm Tiffany O'Donnell. From South Dakota to Ohio, Missouri to Minnesota, predictions of trouble were being voiced.
And I'm Scott Sanborn. The winter of 2008 saw an unprecedented heavy snowfall throughout the Midwest. History, or rather those who study history and our climate, categorize weather events in terms of a year or 10 years, 100, even 500 years.
As the spring of 2008 approached, we were thinking in terms of the year before. We ended up struggling with an event not seen in this part of the world since 300 years before Europeans settled North America.
About the time Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, it was a 500-year flood.
Snow and rain, the lifeblood of the fertile Midwest. It's what brings life to corn and soybean fields, keeps cattle, swine, poultry, And more importantly, the small communities which dot the Midwest alive. And then there are the rivers, the bloodstream, if you will, of the heartland of America.
But in the winter of 2008, we got a lot of snow. And then in the spring came the rain. Today, in 2013, hard on the heels of a drought, it's hard to imagine too much rain. While it's kept farmers out of their fields, the rain also has been a blessing.
This is what we like to see. Good color. It's a little bit yellow for my taste, but I think the warm weather would turn it around and it would be a good corn crop.
Planting of this year's corn crop is nearly 40% behind the 5-year average. The soybean crop is even further behind. Drought, flood, rain, no rain. Farmers persevere.
It's a little behind this year still, but still within what we can deal with.
But in 2008, the snows of February and March fell heavy. Then the snows turned to rain in April. Cedar Rapids ultimately recorded slightly more than 24 inches of rain for the year, more than 10 inches above normal. Combine heavy snowpacks with extraordinary rain, and you get a quick, hard, massive runoff.
In early April, the alarm began sounding. 14 states, the upper Midwest, America's heartland, experienced increasing flood and flash flood watches and warnings. By April 15th, the warning stretched along the Mississippi River for 325 miles, from Dubuque to St. Louis. And along the Iowa tributaries which feed the mighty Mississippi, the Turkey, the Wapsipinicon, the Iowa, the Cedar, and the Des Moines rivers, life was about to become very, very unpleasant.
We all knew that water had to head downriver eventually, and a few days later it did. Waverly, Cedar Falls, Waterloo, Cedar Rapids, and so quickly you couldn't catch your breath.
I'm out here at Sans Souci Island in Waterloo, which was evacuated 2 nights ago with good reason. If you take a look, some of these houses almost completely underwater, and there's just water flowing everywhere.
It's the story so many people are saying. Yesterday they could see their driveways, their curbs. Now everything is underwater, and you can see it's pouring down right now. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
Politicians began warning of the danger. Be prepared, they said. It should be okay, they said. We're prepared, they said.
The capabilities of this community are just outstanding in responding to a disaster.
First responders warned of the danger. Be careful. Be prepared. Listen to the warnings.
We do, however, need to plea again with all citizens to restrict your water usage to only those essential things like drinking.
Cedar Rapidians at first couldn't fully understand the danger. And in Iowa City,
well, other than sheer terror and panic over what is clearly a disaster of unprecedented proportion, my worry for what is happening to the campus and all of the buildings that clearly were being damaged as the floodwaters were coming into them.
How do you think about the unthinkable? Not since 1993. 15 years earlier had Cedar Rapids been seriously threatened by floodwaters. Before that, 1929, just shy of the worst recorded flood here in 1851. As the gravity of the situation, the oncoming threat to places like the National Czech and Slovak Museum began to take hold, our Iowa values kicked in. When a neighbor needs help, don't ask questions. Just do it.
When we return, the flood.
The night before the peak, like a lot of people, you're kind of curious to see the river. And I came down with a couple of my kids and said, we want to go see the river with no idea, like anyone else, that had the next day it was going to be, the worst day basically in Cedar Rapids history.
Here in the Midwest, we face a constant threat of severe weather. Tornadoes, thunderstorms, hail. But when it comes to floods, it's another story. No abrupt warnings, no minute-by-minute Doppler radar, no nearly instantaneous threat.
You see the water coming at you. It's like a slow-moving, slow motion, slowly approaching doom until suddenly it's upon you. On June 13th, 2008, doom arrived in Cedar Rapids.
This is a live look at downtown Cedar Rapids at 9:34 on this Friday morning. Friday the 13th, a Friday we won't soon forget in Cedar Rapids, that's for sure. As the Cedar River has taken over downtown Cedar Rapids, Mays Island, no longer an island, it is underwater at this point.
In the days leading up to that fateful Friday the 13th, a call went out for help. to protect homes west of the river, to protect businesses east of the river, to protect the vital services which keep any modern city alive and functional.
It's still a city of this size. It does tax our resources, even though we have had 3 days to prepare for this.
More than 7,600 volunteers responded to the call. Brigades of volunteers built miles of walls on both sides of the river to protect everything they could.
But this is all residents and volunteers out, just people helping each other, loading pickup trucks and getting it out.
Then the walls were widened, strengthened, made taller, then widened again. By June 10th, 3 days before the Cedar River crested, the U.S. Geological Survey was reporting the highest stream flows in modern history. And still, the water rose.
If you don't need to be in an affected area, stay away, because all you do is get in the way of the people who are doing the job.
It had just one place to go, downstream. And Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, and the infrastructure which supports them were in the way.
Inside this building is one of the wells that feeds the city's water supply. And as you can see, water has come right up to the building. There has been a pretty massive effort to protect the integrity of this building and the well that's inside it. You can see they have sandbagged all around it.
Sandbags, pumps, sheer human effort were simply not enough and faster than anyone could imagine. The stopgap safety measures fell one after another.
At 9 o'clock this morning, the Cedar River hit 31.1 feet. It's expected to crest later today at just a little bit, just a smidge under 32 feet. That shatters the old record.
As the waters rose, they spilled into neighborhoods to the west and the core business district to the east. At slightly more than 31 feet, the water was 19 feet above its normal level, filling low-lying areas, stopped only by the natural barriers of the city's higher ground. CBS 2 news crews tried to map its progress in unconventional ways.
We're coming up on Czech Village now, and if you take a look just off to the left, you can see just how deep the water is in this area. You can see the museum up there. This is one of the areas hardest hit in terms of how much flood water has come up. You look at the doors, many of these shops, it's right up to the very tops of the windows and doors on the first level, in some places even higher.
The waters were unwavering in their quest to move downstream. 10 square miles of Cedar Rapids were suddenly uninhabitable, unusable, gone. More than 1,100 city blocks flooded, more than half of them severely. 10,000 people suddenly had no place to live, and still the unrelenting rain continued to fall.
To work over 30 years and to lose what you worked a lifetime for, it was devastating.
We worked our entire life for what we had, but it's gone.
On the other side of the river, the downtown business district was simply gone, as were the federal courthouse, city and county structures, the structures which keep a city and a county running.
At the time, the first response of the city is always the protection of people's lives, safety. And so here, the fire department itself is being inundated. Their control center is being underwater at the same time. The one that I kind of remember is when the smoke started, coming out of the basement of the Lynn County Courthouse. I mean, the whole building's surrounded. You could see this smoke coming out, and people thought there was obviously a fire of some sort down there.
It's been a very long night there at Mercy Medical Center. So the evacuation, that began around midnight last night. They were bringing in ambulances to transport the patients to other area medical centers. Those ambulances came in from as far as Peoria, Illinois, to help the process go more quickly. In addition to transporting the patients by ambulance, medical Humvees were also used.
One scene of the city's suffering was seen around the world, crossing the Cedar River, a railroad bridge. Hopper cars laden with rock had been placed on the bridge to anchor it down. The plan didn't work.
The railroad bridge has collapsed. It is now floating downstream in the Cedar River. It took just a matter of seconds. We've been watching this for a number of minutes now. It was slowly beginning to tip, beginning to collapse. Once the first rail car tipped over, it was all over from there.
And while all of this was happening in Cedar Rapids, the waters kept rolling downriver, and Iowa City was the next obstacle in its path.
And there, a battle was underway to protect the campus of the University of Iowa. We go there next when we return. June 13th, 2008, the Cedar River crested in Cedar Rapids at just over 31 feet. By this time, roughly 4,000 homes were underwater, and most buildings housing city and county government were as well.
Nubo, the Central Fire Station, the police department's communications equipment, Lynn County offices, even the jail, all virtually islands.
To the south in Iowa City, the hope was that the Coralville Dam and reservoir could hold back the surging river, but precautions were being taken south of the dam as well, and a line was being drawn at the University of Iowa, where the campus straddled both banks of the river.
I recall very vividly waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning on Friday the 13th and looking out the windows of the northwest porch and the president's residence and seeing the water literally in the loading dock at Hansher Auditorium.
Trained as a cell developmental biologist, Sally Mason had become the 20th president of the University of Iowa barely 10 months earlier. Now, having seen the devastation to the north in Cedar Rapids, she and her advisors were dealing with the very survival of the school.
We would convene every 9 a.m. in our war room at the Department of Public Safety on campus, and we would basically go over what we knew had happened and what we were anticipating could happen.
As in Cedar Rapids, the call went out for volunteers to help build fragile walls of sandbags. And when the call came out, literally thousands answered. Because the university lies on both sides of the Iowa River, it was going to take a lot of sandbags to do any good. It was later estimated that more than 6 million sandbags were filled in Johnson County to hold back the water, more than were filled during Hurricane Katrina. It's a record that still stands today. Saturday, June 14th, and the lake behind the Coralville Dam simply couldn't hold the water any longer. The spillway had to be opened, and water 5 feet deep began surging downstream. Evacuation orders went out to those living in North Liberty, Coralville, and Iowa City.
President Sally Mason giving us info on the critical flooding situation here. She says it's an emergency they've never seen before.
Police told us that we were not able to get to our apartment, so we were able to get our animals, pack some clothes and stuff, and had to go find shelter elsewhere.
Iowa City was about to be cut off just south of Interstate 80. The Iowa Department of Transportation closed Highway 6 in 2 places and then shut down bridges along most rivers in eastern Iowa. By June 14th, if you wanted to get across the Iowa River, you needed to go as far west as Grinnell to find an open bridge.
And it's affecting travel. Not just this street is out, but the bridge, the 1-lane bridge that leads over this creek, is not just completely covered on the bridge, it's almost up to the top of the guardrail.
At the university, a bitter struggle was underway, and despite the huge effort, the volunteers were losing. On the west side of the river, now rushing beyond its banks, the Arts campus took a direct hit. The art building fell, as did the art building west. Hansher Auditorium was flooded to the stage level and into the middle of the main floor seats. The entire first floor of the Voxman Music Building was underwater, and the theater building was flooded as well.
On the other side of the river, the Adler Journalism Building and the Becker Communications Study Building were damaged, although less severely than those across the river. The main library, Iowa Memorial Union Building, and Mayflower Residence Hall all had basements and underground parking underwater. The Residence Hall was home for nearly 1,000 students. And yet, in the few critical days before the crest, the university was able to get important library collections and millions of dollars worth of art out of the threatened buildings to safety. Still, when the final tally came, 20 of the university's buildings had been damaged, some only slightly, others significantly.
I think we were all traumatized pretty significantly. I think back on that time and begin to understand how people come out of traumatic experiences with post-traumatic stress syndrome. We didn't have a lot of time. Decisions had to be made quickly. We were only closed for 1 week, and that was my decision.
As floodwaters were finally beginning to recede and the damage was being truly assessed for the first time, the University of Iowa opened for summer school. June 23rd, just 1 week after the river crested.
It was important for us as an institution, and it was important obviously for the students and our faculty and staff and our constituents to show that we would get through this, and we would get through it in a way that would make Iowans and Hawkeyes in particular proud.
In all, the flood event, as it came to be called, lasted just over 3 weeks, from the first dire warnings until the time the rivers return to their banks.
The cleaning up and rebuilding of two cities wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be done quickly. That's next in our second half hour of Rising Above the Waters, the corridor, 5 years later.
We hear every day about millions of dollars that are supposed to be available for the flood victims. Where is the money?
Get going so we can get past all of this, and it's just really frustrating that we just don't know how all this is going to operate.
So far, the owner of the truck has rescued several homeowners as well as several vehicles from these flooded southwest streets.
Have you ever seen anything like this in your life?
Not at all. I was around 93, but not near as big as this.
If we can get a shot of this right back here, there is a street pole that is collapsing literally just now as a truck hit it while we're doing this interview. You just said, never seen anything like this in your whole life.
But finally, the waters began receding, and the residents of Cedar Rapids started assessing the damage. Today, the time check part of the city to the west of the river is a series of vacant lots. It's here where hundreds of homes once stood.
There are a few of the most damaged homes still standing, the owners simply throwing up their hands and walking away. In the days that followed the June 13th crest, the rebuilding began.
Despite the rack and ruin, there had been one significant stroke of good luck. Although the town of Palo, just upstream of Cedar Rapids, had to be completely evacuated of its 980 residents, the state's only nuclear power plant there had survived without any damage, even though the flood cut off communication to it for a period of time. Still, the economic and cultural loss was immense. At the Ellis Boat Harbor, just 40 of the 100 houseboats moored there survived. Jim Cass owned one of them.
With house after house that did cut loose, they would come down the harbor at 10 miles an hour, and a house crashing into a house puts a lot of force.
Jim watched as his own houseboat slammed into a bridge.
Damn it, I really like that stuff. That nice blue roof.
On Mays Island, City Hall, the county courthouse, the jail, and the nearby federal courthouse had water up to the second floor. In Czech Village, the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library's first floor was flooded out, with a loss of many of its artifacts and documents. The African American Museum and Cultural Center of Iowa was also flooded through the first floor. Many of its 1,700 exhibits destroyed. The entire adult and reference sections of the city's public library, more than 150,000 books, magazines, and media were lost. But the children's section was saved by moving it to the second floor. And the Paramount Theater, the heart of Cedar Rapids' cultural community, was flooded up to the first floor. Its 1928 Wurlitzer theater organ console was found floating on the stage. The irony, the theater had just completed a large, expensive renovation. The Mother Mosque of America, the oldest building in the United States built specifically for use as a mosque, lost a century's worth of documents and artifacts stored in its water-filled basement. 25 churches, ministries, and worship centers were destroyed or heavily damaged. But here and there, rare miracles.
Here was this angel table sitting here. We take that as a sign that God's watching over our city, watching over our congregation.
On June 20th, President George W. Bush landed aboard Air Force One to tour the region by air and on foot. He left promising federal aid to rebuild. Remember, 2008 was a presidential election year, so the same day, candidate Senator John McCain came to Iowa to see the damage. Now, State Senator Liz Mathis was working at Horizons, helping with the cleanup.
President Obama was campaigning at the time. You know, he was trying to become president, and he had scheduled a visit at Horizons for that very day. So we had had Secret Service throughout our building the days leading up to that, and he had to cancel his visit, obviously. So during all of this cleaning and trying to get, all of our furniture out of the building, my phone rang, and I thought, well, who's this? And it was Barack Obama.
As the numbers began coming in, the economic loss to the city was staggering.
One of the most vivid memories I have is flying down the Cedar River from the Waterloo Airport to the Cedar Rapids Airport and seeing from the air the devastation all along the river and particularly the overwhelming devastation to downtown Cedar Rapids.
101 of the 132 downtown blocks had been flooded out. All of the 450 businesses in the downtown core were impacted. 900 people living downtown had to find a new place to live. Adjusting for inflation, it's now estimated the flood caused more than $64 billion in damage region-wide to homes, businesses, public facilities, and job losses.
A few days after the flood, I remember when the Quaker Oats sign lit back up. I mean, the place was dark, and for them to get the generator up there and to light that Quaker Oats sign, I think that was really symbolic and gave people, you know, the light, the hope that we're going to get through this.
A small army working not to make Captain Crunch cereal, but working to clean up from the floods here. Look at the lights all the way down this way.
The Cedar Rapids Community School District was also impacted. More than 1,800 students had to be relocated from now flooded schools, and 6 district facilities were damaged. A $33.5 million hit.
But within hours of the crest, the cleanup and rebuilding was already underway.
Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, and eastern Iowa began rebuilding. Rising above the waters, the corridor 5 years later continues in 2 minutes.
Our original plan A was to put long-term flood protection on both sides of the river, and that didn't work out, so we tried Plan B, which is a different financing for the same plan, and that didn't work out. So we're basically at Plan C, which is try to get this built, one segment at a time.
Adversity can either bring out the worst or the best in people, and we were very fortunate in Iowa because I think it brought out the best.
People kind of say this in very silent, they try to, in whispered terms, they'll say, oh, maybe the flood wasn't so bad after all. We gotta knew this or we gotta knew that.
Where and when do you start trying to pick up the pieces of destroyed communities? The answer to the latter question is simple: immediately. 7 days after the flood crested, President George W. Bush toured the devastation and promised immediate federal help.
Officials declared Iowa a federal disaster area and promised emergency funding to the tune of $35 million. The state also allocating $17 million for emergency cleanup and recovery. That meant jobs for many who didn't have one.
But the federal money stalled. Into the fall of 2008, Iowa found itself competing with other disasters. Remember, the lead agency in the federal response was FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. It was a federal agency still reeling from the mistakes of Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana 3 years earlier. Remember those emergency trailers sent to Cedar Rapids to provide temporary housing? The same trailers which had been used in Katrina and which were later proved to be laden with noxious, sometimes life-threatening odors from formaldehyde used to preserve wood in those trailers. CBS 2, in a special report, sent air samples of those trailers to be tested.
Using test kits from a reputable lab, we asked dozens of eastern Iowans living in FEMA mobile homes if we could use this test to determine what's in the air. The big concern, formaldehyde. And what we found sent FEMA scrambling. The state of Iowa is now asking questions, and now people are questioning the roofs over their heads.
Dear God.
30% of the homes we tested, unsafe. But that's not all. When we try to help those with alarming levels get in touch with FEMA, we couldn't believe what happened.
My heart sunk. It's like get a little hope and then boom.
Nobody who is going through a disaster and in temporary housing should be forced to put their health and safety at risk by occupying a temporary shelter the government gives them that has hazardous materials inside it. It was a result of some of the experiences that we had here in Iowa and in Katrina that policy has changed.
It was one of many false starts that seemed a good idea at the time, but just didn't work in practicality. 3 months after the flood, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi came to Cedar Rapids, promising the dam erected against recovery money would be broken.
I want you to know that you have my assurance as Speaker of the House that we will do everything that we possibly can to ensure that every Iowan who is affected by this is helped.
Another was the Jump Start program created by then Governor Chet Culver and the Iowa legislature. It was a promise to get eastern Iowans back into their flood homes more quickly. But for many, it turned into a bureaucratic nightmare of paperwork and shifting from one state relief office to another.
They will not reimburse us for anything we spent after December 10th.
The last trip we made, we were there for around 5 hours. I called every day. They'd put me on hold for 20 minutes at a time, and then they'd hang up on me.
And then there was FEMA itself.
When FEMA first arrived on the ground, they did a great job with emergency response. That is, the immediate aftermath of the tornadoes and the floods. But then, as the recovery went on, it seemed like a lot of the people who first arrived were shifted to other disasters. New people came in, and when you went to town hall meetings, you would hear the same answers to the same questions that people had been hearing for months.
It seemed that FEMA was an agency of two minds. Yes, then no, when it came to helping fix the problems in the corridor. In Cedar Rapids, the city wanted a flood wall to protect against future flooding on both sides of the river. FEMA said now it would only allocate money for the downtown business district. Twice, it's refused any flood wall protection on the west side to protect the time check area.
So when you take the federal government and the local government and maybe what we can put together here locally, we can get this staged over a series of years. But it probably will be, unfortunately, another 7 to 12 years before it's done and completed.
Of course, it doesn't help the city's case that twice in the last 3 years, Cedar Rapids voters have twice rejected extending the local option sales tax, or lost funds, to build flood wall protection on the west side.
And then there is Iowa City and the University of Iowa. At the UI, 20 buildings were damaged, especially the city's arts buildings.
They have been good partners and frustrating partners. There's no doubt about it.
The University of Iowa was suffering post-flood, and 5 years later, it's still rebuilding. Look at the rebuilding of Hancher Auditorium, a project federal agencies had approved, then rejected several times.
In the end, I'm grateful to FEMA for sticking to their guns on our big projects. I'm unhappy, obviously, about the decision on the Art Museum, but I think at this point we can figure that one out.
But eventually, we were able to figure out a lot of stuff.
When we return, rising above the floods and the progress since 2008.
1, 2, 3.
Just 2 weeks ago, there was a celebration in downtown Cedar Rapids. The grand reopening of the U.S. Cellular Center, the Convention Center, and the remodeled DoubleTree by Hilton Hotel.
Combined, the three projects total a $142 million investment in the heart of Cedar Rapids. The celebration, the latest in a string of welcome and expensive rebirths since the floods.
On the east side of the Cedar River, a revitalization of Cedar Rapids core is underway. In addition to the reconstruction of the Cell Center and Convention Center, City Hall is back. 4 years after being forced to flee Mays Island and take interim offices in another part of the city, the council and government offices are back. Not in their old quarters, but in the renovated former federal courthouse.
As for the federal court, it's now part of a gleaming glass high-rise, which marks the southern boundary, if you will, of the core downtown area. New shops and businesses have moved into once ruined stores. Restaurants and pubs now dot the downtown area, and nightlife is slowly reemerging. Two crown jewels of the restoration: the remodeled and restored Theater Cedar Rapids and the total renovation of the Paramount Theater, which reopened its doors just before Christmas last year. And still under construction, the new Central Fire Station and the new downtown public library.
When you see how downtown Cedar Rapids has been reborn in some ways, and you see new businesses moving in, new investments taking place, it kind of gives credibility to some of those statements made early on after the floods hit, when officials were saying, we will rebuild, we will be better, we will be stronger.
And let's not forget about the New Bow District. The New Bohemia portion of Cedar Rapids was virtually underwater in 2008. Now, inside the New Bow City Market and the Rotary Hall, merchants and shops, even a culinary kitchen for students at Kirkwood Community College. This area becoming a linchpin for drawing residents and tourists to the area.
And just across the bridge, here in Czech Village, another renaissance is underway, led by the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library. It too was heavily damaged in the floods, and its revitalization is bringing the rest of Czech Village right along with it. There was no hesitation in the decision to rebuild the library, but there was still the problem of its close proximity to the unprotected west bank of the Cedar River. So, in what became a modern marvel of engineering, the mostly refurbished museum was literally jacked up, pivoted, then relocated on ground 10 feet higher than the original site. And when the library reopened, so did many of the businesses which surround it. The antique shops and bakeries, delis and pubs and restaurants have been discovered by those looking for excitement and entertainment.
Perhaps the most painful part of this story is still unfolding, trying to draw residents back into the area, especially the hardest hit one of time check. We all remember those heartbreaking scenes from 5 years ago.
Don't put your hands on anything. Anything.
Scores, hundreds of water-damaged homes. Some could be fixed or rebuilt, and were, but others could not. The city embarked on a controversial buyout plan. Homeowners who didn't want to rebuild would simply be paid a market value-based price for the home which the city would demolish.
We were able to raise the buyout from 100 to 107%. We were able to get the personal needs and replacement program in place to help flood victims replace their furniture. We started the demo process.
But many have criticized for moving too slowly. FEMA mostly pays for the program, and federal money has come in waves. Others complain that even though the city now owns many homes, its slow process of tearing them down makes them perfect targets for thieves and arson.
When people are financially strained, they're looking to buy a new house or wanting to buy a new house and haven't had the buyout from their old house yet, and really it was a big concern for them, and so it was very stressful for a lot of people, not just the people in the flood community, but elected officials and people that worked in the local government. We're relying on state government funds, we're relying on federal government funds, and you know, we're at the front line.
And let's not forget the University of Iowa and its seriously damaged campus. Some of the damaged buildings, like the main library and the Mayflower Residence Hall, were able to open in a matter of weeks. Others, like Pancher Auditorium and the old Arts Building, became sticking points between the university and FEMA when it came to reconstruction dollars.
We want things to move faster, and they are a bureaucracy, and they are dealing with more disasters than just the one here in Iowa City. So to their credit, they stayed with us. We're pretty far along. Will be done in 8.
Although, in a bitter sense of deja vu, the floods earlier this month along the banks of the Iowa River are once again putting the campus at risk, and we still don't know the impact of this year's storms. And perhaps that is simply the moral to all that's been done in the wake of the 2008 floods. We still live by our rivers and creeks.
And as this year has shown us, we may never get away from the threat of flooding. Some final thoughts when Rising Above the Waters, the corridor 5 years later, continues.
Looking back 5 years later, the 2008 floods were the most catastrophic disaster to hit the corridor in recent memory. More than $65 billion in damage, loss, and repair. More than 3,500 jobs lost, some of which will never come back.
And yet here in the corridor, there is a sense of resiliency, a value in ourselves and our community, from Solon to Palo, Mount Vernon to Coralville, Iowa City to Cedar Rapids. When adversity arrives, we persevere.
Which brings us to recent events. In just the past few weeks, we've been threatened again, and we met that challenge. From volunteers struggling to meet the threat, to the rebuilt Nubo District and Czech Village, to hundreds answering the bell when the University of Iowa called for help. We heard and responded.
As those long days at the end of May and early June showed us, we still have many unanswered questions. Will this city have adequate flood protection on both sides of the river? Will leaders ever decide this is not the place to build? And how many times can the University of Iowa rebuild? Who pays the bill?
We still don't have the answers, but those are the questions we here at CBS 2 will continue to ask.
For all of us here at CBS 2, good night.